Good day, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the inaugural director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And one of our groups is called the Global China Initiative. Their mission is to advance the extent to which China's overseas economic activity and engagement with international financial institutions also enables financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world. And ever since the Belt and Road Initiative was started, the GCI group has been doing theoretically driven and empirical-based research on the trends, determinants, and impacts of the BRI. And we have culminated and synthesized that work in a brand new report that we released this week called the BRI at 10, Maximizing the Benefits and Minimizing the Risks. We have two of our researchers here from the GDP Center, Orientarella Moses, or Torella. She's a data analyst and team lead for our data project. We run a number of databases that look at the trends of Chinese overseas economic activity. And Dr. Rebecca Ray, she's a senior academic researcher at the Global China Initiative and is also the team leader for our work on what we call the FAIR BRI, Forest, Agriculture, and Indigenous Rights in the Belt and Road Initiative. We're very honored to have two friends of the center and absolute luminaries and analysts and observers of the BRI and China's overseas economic activity in Yunnan Chen and Ambassador Jorge Heine. Yunnan Chen is a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute's Development and Public Finance program. Her work centers on changing development finance architecture and the role of global China. She holds a specialist interest in the role of Chinese development finance, overseas lending, and debt architecture, and the role of national development banks and development finance institutions in Africa. Previously, she was a Global China Fellow here at the GDP Center and a pre-doctoral fellow at the Center for Global Development. She's been a researcher at the SAIS China Africa Research Initiative and is a PhD candidate at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. And we also have Ambassador Jorge Heine. He is a core faculty member of the Global China Initiative here at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. He's a research professor at the Frederick S. Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, where he's also the interim director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. He's a distinguished lawyer, distinguished scholar, distinguished diplomat with a special interest in the international politics of the Global South. He has two new books on these issues. He was also the ambassador from his native Chile to China from 2014 to 2017, to India 2003 to 2007, and South Africa 1994 to 1999. First, my two colleagues, Torella and Rebecca, will give a short synthesis of our report, followed by commentary by Yunnan and Ambassador Heine. We'll have a short conversation amongst ourselves. I'll ask some of the panelists some questions, but then we want to open it up and have a global conversation about this. And so you'll notice in the bottom of your screen that there's a little Q&A button. Feel free throughout the talk, and especially during the Q&A period, to click that button, tell us your name and affiliation so we can get to know each other a little bit, and put your question in there, and we'll field as many rounds as we can until we get to the top of the hour. I should note that today's webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so you can tell your friends about that. And it'll also be on the GDP Center's YouTube page for folks to be able to look at after today's webinar. So thanks everyone for coming. Now I'll pass it over to my colleague, Torella Moses, to get us started on a synthesis of our new report here at the GDP Center.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Just give me a moment here while I share my screen and put it in full view here. Okay, so as Kevin mentioned, today I'll be walking you all through the benefits part of the Belt and Road Initiative at 10 report that we've put together. Kevin has already given you a background of our mission at the GDP Center, which is to produce policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. We also aim to do this in our Global China Initiative, where we advance policy-oriented research on China's overseas economic activity and engagement with international institutions. So today I'll be walking you through this outline here of the Belt and Road Initiative report. I'll first dive into the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative, which include an increased scale of finance and liquidity for emerging markets and developing economies, inducing economic growth and leading to complementarity and country agency, as well as increasing low carbon energy and energy access. And then Rebecca Ray will walk you through the Belt and Road Initiative risks, such as accentuating debt distress, lack of transparency, supporting fossil fuel energy composition, and then negative impacts on the environment. Lastly, we'll finish up with our recommendation for the future of the Belt and Road Initiative, which should be to maximize benefits and minimize risks based on policy recommendations that we have for both China and host countries. So let's jump into the benefits here. The first benefit that we see of the Belt and Road Initiative is increased scale of development and liquidity finance. So since the inception of the Belt and Road Initiative, there were several push and pull factors that really led to high amounts of finance that we saw coming out of China. First, in terms of push factors, there was China had an overcapacity in infrastructure-related sectors, coupled with a current account surplus and a need to secure import supply of commodities. And so these factors were addressed by the Going Out policy and later the Belt and Road Initiative policy. There were also pull factors on the host country side, where there are several finance gaps, as well as infrastructure gaps, and a preference for Chinese finance since it had less policy conditionality and preferable terms in relation to commercial-based finance. And so we saw that from 2008 to 2021, China's development finance institutions supplied $498 billion in financing, which is about 83% of what the World Bank supplied in terms of sovereign lending. During Belt and Road Initiative years, specifically from 2013 to 2021, these development finance institutions supplied $331 billion in sovereign lending. In Africa, where we have data beyond China's development finance institutions, we see a combination of Chinese DFIs, state-owned commercial banks, companies, and other financiers supplied $114 billion during the years of the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI has also led to an increase in liquidity finance. So China has contributed approximately $910 billion to the global financial safety net, which is a set of arrangements and tools that are established to help mitigate short-term financial crises. And we see here from this figure that China has contributed bilateral swap arrangements, BRICS contingent reserve arrangement, and then the Chiang Mai initiative multilateralization, which has contributed significant funds to the GFSN. Chinese finance has also induced economic growth and helped to address infrastructure finance gaps. This is mostly because a lot of China's overseas development finance from CDB and Checksum is primarily directed to infrastructure-related sectors and such as energy and transport. And oftentimes this financing has been associated with overcoming infrastructure bottlenecks. In comparison, World Bank financing has been primarily directed to soft infrastructure sectors such as agriculture and public administration. And so countries see these two sorts of financing as really complements to one another. This is more clear when we look at how countries borrowed from the World Bank and China's development finance institutions. So of the 100 countries that we have studied that have borrowed from China's DFIs, 72 of them have borrowed more from the World Bank or about the same from China and the World Bank. And so there is a level of complement that these two sources of finance have with one another. Lastly, in terms of benefits, we see an increasing trend towards financial support for low carbon energy and in general, just energy access. We've seen that a combination of development finance financing from development finance institutions, from foreign direct investment, from commercial banks has led to an increase in renewable energy financing and to about 25 gigawatts of renewable energy access from China. And in terms of future prospects, foreign direct investment, which has primarily supported solar and wind projects, as well as the strength of China's solar industry, really bodes well for China's ability to continue to support low carbon growth in developing countries and emerging markets. And with that, I'll pass it on to Becky to discuss the risks.
Thank you so much, Tarella. As she mentioned, I'll discuss some of the emerging risks that we see in the BRI, steps that have been taken to minimize those risks, and steps that still remain in front of the world as we continue to try to make the BRI as beneficial and as least risky as possible. Next slide, please. The first risk I'll talk about is the risk of debt distress. It's no exaggeration to say that since the last global recession, emerging market and developing economy debt has ballooned. It has skyrocketed. As you can see in the chart on the left-hand side here, this shows you all public and publicly guaranteed debt, or PPG debt, defined as the World Bank defines it, among all emerging market and developing economies, or EMDEs, in 2008 and 2021. It's really quite stark to see that it's essentially tripled in the last 30 years, basically. China plays a relatively small role in this when we look at EMDEs overall, right? This is trillions of US dollars. We're talking about $100 billion from China compared to 3.5 trillion overall. However, on the right-hand side, the same graph is repeated, focusing only on those EMDEs in or at risk of debt distress. This is measured in billions of dollars. You can see that this comes out to about a quarter of the total amount in EMDEs. And here, China plays a much more significant role, 102 out of 879 total, certainly more than the Paris Club. And here it's so important to continue working on transparency and continue working on collaboration. In the pandemic, during the worst years of the pandemic, the G20 initiated the Debt Service Suspension Initiative to help suspend, at least temporarily, payments during those years. China suspended more debt through the DSSI than any other creditor. As the world's largest bilateral creditor, that was only fitting, but much work remains in front of China and host countries on transparency and working together to resolve these remaining debts, which continue to be very high. Next slide, please. The next risk I'll talk about is the climate risk. Here we see the energy composition of Chinese financed and Chinese invested power plants around the world. First, at the top, those that are in operation already, then those under construction and those that are still in planning. These are color-coded gigawatt by their power. And as you can see, among those already in operation, fossil fuels represent the majority of power, with coal dominating as the #1 source. Of course, famously, China announced it would no longer support coal overseas. And we do see that difference. When we look at those projects that are still under planning, coal is diminishing dramatically. So while projects in the pipeline are still coming into fruition, we really see that difference with new projects that are being planned. Instead, we see a switch towards the dominance of hydropower in blue there. Of course, hydropower brings its own risks, specifically to local communities who may be displaced, or to local ecosystems which may be flooded. And on that note, I'd like to take a moment and talk about risks to local biodiversity and indigenous communities. Next slide, please. My colleague Tyrella compared Chinese development lending with World Bank lending, and this slide does the same, but specifically focusing on the risks to biodiversity and to indigenous lands in the lending portfolio of each group of lenders. Now, this does not mean that these projects are bad, only that these projects have risks that need to be mitigated with special care and governance. So in the red bars here, we show risks from Chinese development finance institution-backed projects based on where they are located. And in gray bars, we show those same risks in the World Bank portfolio. All of those asterisks indicate statistical significance. So we can see that on the left-hand side of each graph, Chinese development finance overall portfolio-wide does represent significantly more risks, both to biodiversity and indigenous lands. That might be expected because of the sectoral breakdown that Tyrella showed. They're disproportionately in transportation and energy projects. But even within those sectors, we also see that difference. Within energy and extraction sectors, Chinese loans bring more risks to biodiversity, or have when we consider the entire time period together. However, there is progress being made in mitigating those risks, and that progress is important to highlight and to continue to work on. So next slide, please. Here I've highlighted 5 recent reforms at top levels of the Chinese government to develop a green BRI, improve performance of Chinese firms overseas, and create mechanism for accountability when that performance does not come. The most recent is this year, the development of an independent complaints mechanism through the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for mining and chemicals to be able to ensure that international standards are in fact met at Chinese development sites around the world. So this progress is important to mitigate these risks, but much work continues to be made as we move towards a green BRI with sustainable economic development around the world, which was the promise. And for that, I'll turn it back over to Kevin Gallagher to discuss policy recommendations.
Thanks a lot, Becky. Well, we really want to commend China for a really great first 10 years of the Belt Road Initiative. As we've done in our research, we've shown that this has brought some significant benefits, but also has accentuated existing risks in the global economy. Our major recommendation for China and host countries alike is to, for the next decade, to maximize those benefits and minimize those risks. Specifically, we suggest that China create a green and low carbon energy project pipeline facility. China's made this, as Becky said, major move to stop financing coal and to move into low carbon growth. That's one thing to announce it, but to create a pipeline facility where China can help countries put together bankable projects that are aligned with their new directives will be a great act of South-South cooperation and help countries make low carbon transitions around the world. Secondly, to further leverage China's unique business model for green development and decarbonization, the International Monetary Fund's Global Financial Stability Report last year showed that the Western-backed development banks have struggled to crowd in private sector finance on infrastructure projects and beyond. China has a unique model where the state guides overseas economic activity that can put together blending activity that can bring infrastructure, energy access, and low carbon growth to countries in a way that that is a little bit more coordinated, as we call it, than the Western model. Third, building on the last graph that Becky just showed, is to establish compulsory criteria for environmental, social, and risk management. And fourth, to bolster and expand liquidity. We're in a moment in the world where there's a major liquidity crunch, but also a number of countries that have solvency issues. China is said to be unveiling a new debt sustainability analysis framework at the BRI summit next week. That will be important, but also to work at the multilateral level to unlock some of the fragmentations that it's occurring in the ongoing effort to try to resolve the increasing debt and development crisis across the developing world. But it takes two to tango, as Tyrella said, that the BRI is a partnership. It's a global partnership of South-South cooperation, and host countries and partner countries need to play a key role as well. It's now pretty clear what kinds of projects you can get from the BRI and from China, what kinds you can get from Western development banks and so forth. And it will be important for host countries to tailor specific proposals that are aligned with China's strengths and priorities. Secondly, to tailor and bolster their own environment and social risk management frameworks for an influx of Chinese investment. As we've shown in some of our work, in many cases, Chinese regulations at home are relatively weaker than some of the places where they're investing overseas. And because China is a relatively newcomer in terms of global investment, it takes them a while to adjust to the new regulatory environments in other countries. And it's important for those countries to make a special effort for their newfound friends in investment to make sure that they adhere to standards and tailor specific standards to the Chinese experience. And finally, one of the other things that Torella mentioned, that's okay. One of the other things that Torella mentioned is that the influx of Chinese investment around the world, essentially adding another World Bank to the global financial architecture, enables countries to have more agency. There are more choices now in the global economy for different kinds of projects that countries want, and to take more advantage of that, to try to create healthy competition. And one core thing that we've been doing a lot of research on is transition minerals. There's a global race as we look to make a more low carbon, climate resilient, and socially inclusive world economy. There's a race for transition materials. Most of those are in the global south. How can those countries leverage those, not only to supply important raw materials to the global north as it makes this transition, but to use that as a lever for their own sustainable economic growth moving forward? Well, thanks so much for your time and attention to this. There's a link in the chat where you can look at the report and go to our webpage here to find out about what the GDP Center does in general, but our Global China Initiative in particular. We've published, I don't know how many research articles, a policy brief, and opinion articles on the BRI over its first decade, and look forward to following and tracking it over its next decade. We can take down the slides. Now I'd like to move to our two colleagues, Yunnan Chen and Ambassador Heine. Let's start with Yunnan.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. And just first to say congratulations to the whole team behind this fantastic report, and congratulations as well to the BU GDP Center as well for this ongoing work of many years that has fed into this report and work that I've also had the pleasure to see firsthand as well. I mean, this paper does a fantastic job of actually very succinctly bringing together a huge plethora of evidence and quality research on the benefits and also some of these pitfalls that the BRI has involved. And so, I mean, I'll try and keep my comments quite brief and to tie them into some of the key highlights that come from the report. First, I think, is that there is a clear developmental role that the BRI has played. And when it was first launched, it was seen as sort of a diplomatic exercise. It was China's sort of rising up to provide something to the world. And the framing of finance as development finance, I think, can be maybe a contentious framing for some. A lot of these loans are commercially motivated. They're not subsidized by foreign aid, and they certainly stand very much apart from the traditional models of development finance as has come from the OECD and the MDBs. However, it has played a clear role in filling some of that financing gap for developing countries, and it's also played a really critical role in key sectors of energy and transport. And I've seen this as well from my own field work. The very pivotal role that Chinese finance has played in building roads, railways, industrial zones that have supported directly the demands of developing countries who are trying to move up the value chain, to support their own domestic industries, to economically transform. Having adequate supply of power, having smooth logistics is critical to wider industrial development and to wider structural transformation. And there's a plethora of evidence as well on just the importance of improving connectivity for trade and for investment. The paper also highlights this complementarity, I think, that Chinese finance plays as well to what other development actors are doing. And it's very, very clear as well in showing the trends and the contrast between Chinese finance and that of the MDBs. Just what a dearth of financing there's been from other donors in this period, right? This is the outflow of the BRI is a period of time when traditional donors and the multilateral development banks have largely stepped back from financing this type of economic infrastructure that is so needed. And so one benefit as well of the BRI, I think, has been triggering a shift in norms and in pushing, the importance of supporting connectivity infrastructure again for the traditional donors. And we're seeing that now with the rollout of the Global Gateway and the PGII. And there's clearly a critical role for public finance and official finance in making these projects bankable. And I also see in my own research on China's export credit agency Sinosure that aligns with some of the findings that you raise, where Sinosure has also played a critical role, particularly in key sectors such as energy, in de-risking some of this long-term patient capital to support key projects in key BRI partners, but also this pullback and a lower risk appetite from Sinosure has also coincided with this pullback of lending from the policy banks that your research highlights. And I think this is a slightly worrying trend, right? The BRI, when it was first announced, it reflected a Chinese economy that was still in a very exuberant form, that had a lot of excess capital and excess capacity to offshore. This is the push factors that you highlight. And I don't think we're going to see the same kind of modalities of finance that we saw over the last 10 years. I think that there is going to be a change in direction, and also in the ways that export credit agencies are supporting greater investment in underwriting overseas FDI rather than the long-term lending of the previous decade. I think we are going to see a shift in modalities over the BRI in the next 10 years. But given this withdrawal of lending, I think there's also an open question of this healthy competition that you highlighted, Kevin. What does this mean for the MDBs, for DFIs and donors from the OECD in what they're going to bring to the table through the PGII and the Global Gateway in satisfying and meeting this continued demand for investment and for infrastructure finance from developing countries who are also a lot more cash strapped in this current context. And congrats again, and I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yunnan. Ambassador Heine. You're on mute, my friend.
Thank you, Kevin, and congratulations for an excellent report. There's a reason why top media, top policymakers, top decision makers in the world, when they want to know what is happening in the relationship between China and the Global South, they turn to the GDP Center and their publications. And this report confirms the reasons for that. But without further ado, let me dwell onto what I see as important in the BRI. There's, of course, and Kevin alluded to it, quite a debate on BRI in the world today, on the 10 years. And there are sort of two narratives. One is the biggest development program the world has ever seen. That is one. And the other is the biggest debt trap that has ever been played. So which is it? Let me give you my own take. I arrived in Beijing in July of 2014, only a few months after the Belt and Road initiative had been announced. And I must confess, I was very skeptical at the time. I thought, in Latin America, we're used to big foreign policy announcements that end up being smoke and mirrors. And I said, this is going to be much the same. Where is all this money going to come from? which are the institutions that are going to manage it? I was, quite skeptical. But as time went by, I saw that, in fact, there was a budget, resources were being allocated. The AIIB was established, and I was very much there, able to witness it firsthand. And I saw that, well, this was serious. And you look back now, and obviously we can, debate many aspects of the BRI, but there are facts on the ground. There is a new railway line from Vientiane to Yunnan province, going through some of the most difficult terrain in Southeast Asia. 75% of it is tunnels and bridges, which gives you an idea of the sort of terrain it's gone through. It's a $5.6 billion project. Something similar can be said about new railway projects in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in a part of the world for 100 years. No new railway projects had taken place. In South America, we have the Chancay port, a $3.6 billion port that will become essentially the gateway from South America to Asia, being built by COSCO, the Chinese company. So we are seeing these are real things that are changing the material reality of countries in the global South. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, the other point I would like to emphasize is that what the BRI did was to submit a new view of what development is all about. What the BRI says is that it is not enough to have macroeconomic equilibria, to fight inflation, to have a suitable business climate, and that somehow development will happen on its own, which is the traditional view that we get from the Bretton Woods institution. What the BRI says is that you also need, and this is very important, you need infrastructure and you need connectivity. That is what China did. And what it says to the global South is, if you do this, you will get development. And what the report does, of course, is that it establishes that those things, in fact, make a difference, that they produce growth, and that moving from, investment in sort of so-called soft development issues like education, like health, like public administration, to the hard development questions like infrastructure makes a difference. Countries grow as a result of that. And that, it seems to me, is one of the great merits of the report. Now, let me refer also to a very interesting question, and that is the place of Latin America in the BRI. Of course, Latin America was not originally part of the BRI. Marco Polo never crossed the Pacific. The basic initial idea of BRI was to recreate, the Silk Road, a new Silk Road, connecting the biggest market in the world, which is the European Union, with the fastest growing region in the world, which is East Asia. And, the Americas didn't show up in this. Now, what is interesting is that how did Latin America end up in the BRI? Well, this was, as it has been written, a co-production of China and Latin America. This was not simply a Chinese initiative. We in Latin America were very interested in being part of this and work together with China to make this happen. So today we have 21 countries in Latin America that have signed on to BRI and with MOUs, and 8 countries that are part of the AIIB. And if I may say so, now on Saturday, President Boric of Chile will be arriving in China for his first visit to China. He will participate in the 3rd BRI International Cooperation Forum that will take place in Beijing next week. And this will mean that Chile will be the only country in Latin America that will have had one of its presidents in all 3 of these BRI forums. Michelle Bachelet participated in it in May of 2017, and I was lucky to be able to join her in that. Then President Piñera participated in the one in April of 2019, and now President Boric will do so. President Bachelet was also the first head of state to visit AIIB headquarters. So what I'm saying is that Chile, which is the country that is the farthest away from China in the world, Chinese school children are taught that if they dig a hole in the ground and they go all the way through, they will appear in Chile. And yet, for Chile, Belt and Road Initiative has been a very significant element. And, I was just looking at some numbers. Chile has developed its infrastructure quite effectively. According to some rankings, it has the best infrastructure in Latin America today. But investment in this infrastructure has been lagging in the past few years. We need more of that. The Minister of Public Works of Chile, Jessica Lopez, will be joining President Boric in this visit. And we very much hope that we can get more Chinese companies to invest in Chilean infrastructure and give an additional boost to the country's development. It is very much needed. As we all know, Latin America in general has a strong deficit in infrastructure, and more investment is needed in that regard. Finally, let me close on the following note. For much of these 10 years, we have heard a very heavy criticism of the BRI, saying that it is a debt trap, that is designed to build white elephants that nobody needs, and so on and so forth. Well, suddenly now the narrative has changed. As Yunnan said, what we're hearing now from northern capitals is, well, apparently infrastructure is actually needed. And we are going to come up with our own programs to build infrastructure. You may have heard President Biden announcing in New Delhi at the G20 summit, this corridor from India all the way to Europe. I had never heard a US president talking about those kinds of projects. Well, it seems to me that the narrative has changed. He also mentioned another project, a corridor from Lobito to Zambia, a railway project. Well, again, the narrative is changing, and it seems to me it's a welcome thing. The more, the merrier, and the more infrastructure, the more connectivity, the better we will be off. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Friends, I'm going to ask each of the panelists one question, and I'm going to ask each of you to be very short in your answer so that we can have a conversation with those in the audience. While we're having this short discussion, those of you who are in the audience, please go to the Q&A button, tell us your name and affiliation, and put a question in there, and we'll do a round with you. So if I could just quickly go in the order that each of you made a presentation. We'll start with Tarella. Professor Heine just mentioned, and so did Yunnan, that in parallel with the BRI, there's been a number of Western initiatives, the PGII, the Gateway, and these new ones announced at the G20. Tarella has co-authored and tracks those for the GDP Center. Tarella, could you tell us the status and promise of some of those initiatives? For Becky, you can't tell because all of us at the GDP Center look like we're sitting out here on a sunny day in Shanghai behind us, but it's actually nighttime there. She's actually in South America right now. She was in Brazil, and now she's in Mexico City. If you could, and she's done a lot of our work on biodiversity and so forth. Can you talk about some of the implications for that region in particular, and how the BRI might be perceived from some of them? And then with Yunnan, you've done at the ODI, you've done a landmark study that shows that China hasn't been doing all this on its own, that during the same period, China's become a significant member of just about every Western multilateral development finance institution. It's a member of the CAF, it's a member of the African Development Bank, it's a member of the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. To what extent has the BRI and China's presence in these institutions helped shape the role that they have been? And finally, Professor Heine, a question for you would be, you've written a landmark book now on trying to reinvigorate somewhat of a 9-aligned movement. You've also been an ambassador to some of the core BRICS countries, and the BRICS are attempting to revive themselves in the new moment. What would your lesson be to other developing countries on how they can maximize agency in this new world of healthy competition and different kinds of initiatives across the world? I know those are all big questions, and we could talk all day about those. Please, some short answers to spark more conversation with those of us who are in the crowd. So we'll start with Tarella.
Thank you, Kevin. And as Kevin mentioned, we wrote a report that looked at comparing the Belt and Road Initiative and the PGII, including the Global Gateway. Last year, that looked at complementarity between those two initiatives. And what I think we found, at least based on my tracking, is that there has been, at least like these initiatives have inspired projects from donors that have traditionally not been lending in infrastructure sectors. So recently, the US Export-Import Bank supported a 900 million solar project in Angola, which is also a country that has taken out significant energy financing from China as well. So you see there is kind of this inspiration of these new projects that are supporting for climate friendly growth. And so in the future, the hope is that these initiatives would continue to come together with MDBs, as well as continue to inspire even more financing to reach its goal of 600 billion that the PGII initially pledged, which I think is a tall order, but we're hoping that for the benefit of developing countries and emerging markets, that this will be welcomed in addition to adding to the finance they've already received from China and other sources.
Thanks, Tarella. Becky.
Yes, thank you for asking about the China-LAC relationship. As Ambassador Heine said, LAC, the Latin American Caribbean region, was not originally envisioned as part of the BRI, and yet many of the countries in the region have joined the BRI formally, the AIIB, or other avenues of important cooperation with China. And this has been a co-production, as he said. This is particularly interesting and important in emerging supply chains related to renewable energy and electric mobility. Latin America and the Caribbean has the majority of the world's resources when it comes to certain critical minerals for transitions, such as copper and lithium, also has tremendous capacity for generating renewable electricity. For example, the deserts of northern Chile and Argentina are almost unparalleled in their solar potential, and the wind potential off the coast of southern Argentina, again, nearly unparalleled in the world. In addition to that, automobile manufacturing capacity in Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil make the region an important avenue for these emerging supply chains. But bringing together downstream and upstream ends of supply chains has been a long-term unfulfilled vision of the region. And anyone who's interested in hearing more about that should tune into or see our YouTube video of the recent book talk on the world that Latin America created by Margarita Fajardo a few weeks ago. What's been standing in the way, in part, are hard infrastructure and policy coordination. Those are two things that the BRI purports to provide. So in theory, the BRI could be a very important avenue for Latin America and the Caribbean to take advantage of its opportunities to build into its long-term vision of integrated and sustained and diversified supply chains. However, as I mentioned in the risk section, this will require attention, governance, care, and mitigating the risks involved. Thanks.
Thanks, Becky. Yunnan on China and the Western institutions.
So China's role in the MDBs has been one that we've also seen a huge growth or a rise in over the same period that we see this culmination of China's bilateral finance in the BRI, in the same period where China was trying to offshore some of its excess capital or its surplus capital bilaterally through BRI lending. It was also trying to really shift and inject new capital into the MDBs as well, particularly through core contributions, but also through other co-financing funds. And at ODI, we also wrote a paper about this on China and the MDBs. And there's a similar kind of purpose that they serve, right? But both of this bilateral track and the multilateral track have sort of behaved in parallel. The similarities are that China's role in some of these MDB financing funds has also tried to push the MDBs to support a bit more of what China does bilaterally, to push it a bit harder to supporting hard infrastructure and to supporting economic connectivity. And the establishment of the AIIB in this period also raised some hackles in the West around a new MDB that's supposed to be also supporting the BRI. We haven't really seen that happen. They seem to be parallel, going in similar directions, but very, very separate. But China has always had a little bit of a prickly relationship with the MDBs, and as it's tried to put in this capital, it's also been trying to really increase its voice and representation. And this has been a contentious issue that has faced a lot of resistance. And even in the current MDB reforms that are ongoing, the annual meetings happening this week, we're not seeing any major change in what the structures of these institutions look like. And I think this also lies or underlies a lot of the conflicts between China and traditional donors around issues of debt restructuring as well, for example. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Ambassador Heine.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you for mentioning our recent book with my colleagues, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. What we lay out there is that precisely in this turbulent world in which we find ourselves, there are new options for countries in the global south, in Latin America, but also elsewhere in Africa and Asia. And the whole idea is that countries do not have to choose. They do not have to choose between, say, the West and other options, between the Bretton Woods institutions and other options. Now they can have both. They can have the both of both worlds. The whole idea is that there be more choice, that countries can complement, as the report lays out so nicely. They can complement lending from the World Bank and also from the AIIB, from other institutions. There's also the New Development Bank and so on. So there's a whole new world out there. The term that has been coined is collective financial statecraft, which is very different from the diplomatie de cahier de doléances of the 20th century. Now you have these new institutions. They provide alternatives to countries in the global south, and they should take advantage of it. It seems to me that the challenge is to do that in these difficult times. You look at that, and competition is a good thing. What we are hearing about these new infrastructure initiatives from the G7, I think should be welcome. It means there will be more options for developing countries that are finding themselves in such dire straits.
Thank you very much to all of you. We have a handful of questions that we've received from folks in the audience. I'm going to read them all, and then if we, why don't we go in reverse order so we can let our guests from outside of the GDP Center go first, so we could go in the reverse order here and make any remarks based on any of these questions. So our first question is from Erica Huang, and she's a political science student at the University of Texas, Austin. And she says, I wonder, given the latest trend of Chinese overseas finance, such as the smaller scale and higher standard, will the BRI be updated or replaced or complemented by some other initiatives? Will it have an impact on China's selection on borrower and host countries? And what are the roles of the policy banks and SOEs as China scales down the level, but perhaps increases the quality of overseas finance under the BRI and beyond? Then we have Susanna Nudelsman. She is a CARI Argentine Council for International Relations scholar. And she says, what is the reaction of Western countries to the BRI? We've talked about that a little bit. And the last question is Winston Dukerin. His is specifically for Professor Heine. And he says, could you comment on the geopolitical cost facing small countries in pursuing an active non-alignment foreign policy? Thank you very much for those three questions. We'll allow our panelists, why don't we go in the reverse order with Professor Heine, and we'll see if we have another round after that. Professor Heine.
Well, yes, thank you. And thank you, Winston Dukeran, for some of you may not know. Winston Dukeran is former foreign minister, former governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and a good friend. Thank you for your question. I think that is a very pertinent question. Some colleagues have observed that active non-alignment, while an opportunity for the bigger countries in Latin America and in Africa and Asia, is obviously, according to them, not so much one for smaller countries like those of the Caribbean. I must say I'm not quite sure. It seems to me that both in terms of the history. The Caribbean, Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada played an important role in the non-aligned movement in the 70s and 80s. And nowadays, on a key issue like climate change, Barbados is playing a very important role, trying to somehow bring together the views of the North and of the South. So I must say, I'm quite optimistic about the role that countries in the Caribbean that have strong diplomatic traditions can play in this new setting in which active non-alignment is playing such a significant role.
Thank you. Yunnan Chen, any answers to those questions or a final remark?
Sure. So I don't think that BRI is dead, even if it is moving to a smaller scale or slowing down in terms of overseas lending. It is clearly something that has a political backing behind it and has always been a very key part of China's kind of official engagement with the global South. I think that will remain. However, I think there are some signs that the BRI is no longer the only sort of platform through which China is trying to engage with developing countries. And the announcement of the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, all of these signal a sort of diversification as well in terms of how China is trying to broaden its relationships and engagement with global South countries along different kind of themes. It's still a little unclear in what areas they will overlap with the BRI. And I think part of this diversification that we've seen is also because of, in tying into the other question, this very kind of negative PR optics that the BRI has gained in the last 5 years or so, this rise of the debt trap narrative, which although debunked has still left a little bit of a negative connotation with the BRI. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Yunnan.
Thanks. Well, Yunnan mentioned something in her first comment that I thought was worth highlighting in this context, which is that Chinese development finance institutions have in the past issued a variety of financial instruments that are not necessarily all what one would expect to receive from a development finance institution. While Exim Bank has provided subsidized credit at below market rates, China Development Bank, although it does consider itself a development finance institution, and in fact is the largest development bank in the world, lends at commercial rates. And so there's a mix of commercial and traditional development lending presented. What we see now is a more diversification of instruments for specific types of projects. So Yunnan mentioned the Global Development Initiative for specifically focusing on aid. Tyrella has written, and I won't go over the details because she's the expert here. Tyrella has written on the rise of overseas development equity investment groups from China. And so we see this is not surprising, as development finance very often, especially when supporting physical infrastructure, is laying the groundwork for commercial firms to then come in and provide equity investment, either through corporate direct investment or through equity investment through one of these development investment funds. And so we see a shift, but it might be more of a maturation than anything else, in that development finance was always, even in early BRI documents, presented as an early step that would then open up relationships to allow more investment and deeper connectivity, both politically, person to person, and business to business. And so we may be seeing rather a step towards the next phase of the BRI, which might be less dependent on sovereign lending and more diversified as firms.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Thanks, Becky. She's not slurring her words; it's her connection. Tyrella, if you can make some final remarks. And there was one question that just got added that you're good to react to. Peter Halesworth asks, are U.S. concerns valid about the dual use of some of the hard infrastructure, such as the use of ports by the Chinese Navy or PRC surveillance through telecom networks?
Thanks, Kevin. I think both Rebecca and Yunnan really mentioned, I think, what could be the future of the BRI, which is diversification in terms of tools, in terms of financing mechanisms, but also in terms of the different borrowers or host country that could have relatively more access to financing. And I say this by using data that we recently released on overseas lending and development finance in Africa, where we saw a diversification of borrowers, as well as a diversification of the different sectors that receive financing. So we saw on the borrower side, regions that have historically borrowed less from China received relatively more financing, in countries that have borrowed historically less from China also borrowed more from China. And then we also saw financing to more so soft infrastructure sectors and sectors that had more of a positive impact on the environment. And so I think in just thinking about this future here, I think policy banks and SOEs will have more of a stronger focus on projects in terms of their economic feasibility, in some cases their political significance, but ultimately their impacts that they will have on the host countries that are taking on this lending, given the past risks that we have discussed in our report. So thank you.
Thank you, Torella. Well, we've run out of time, everyone. I really want to thank everyone for being part of this webinar, especially our guests, Ambassador Jorge Heine and Yunnan Chen. You can look at we put things in the chat from both of their research. And thank you, Torella and Becky, for presenting our new report. If you want to learn more about what the GDP Center is up to, you can follow us on Twitter and look at our webpage. Until next time, thank you very much.